mechanism for defining and coordinating stakeholder responsibilities for information is useful. Lastly, I briefly mentioned research. Not necessarily, doesn't have to be expensive. Focus group research can be very cheap, but to know what people don't know about registration and what they feel they need to know is very important before they start informing. Transparency. Now, a lot of people think of transparency as going, yep, people can come into a registration centre and what's happening. That's only a small part of it. It means that all processes to do with registration are open to scrutiny. Now, what happens in the registration centre is only a very small part of the registration process. To get stakeholder and monitor access to things like decision making, and this is often important where political parties do not have ex officio access to the electoral management body decisions. How do they get informed? To have access to the tender processes so that they are public for any systems that are being tendered for voter registration. To allow voters to make sure they have reasonable access to their own data to make sure it's correct. To have access to any ICT code so that it can be independently and transparently audited, are all other important parts. It's the whole process that needs to be transparent, not just the points where people apply. Public audits and evaluations are also really important for transparency. If those responsible for registration aren't open, do not hold regular briefings, there tends to be suspicion about what is happening. So proactive cycle of regular briefings to all stakeholders on what is happening with the registration process is important. And that comes with being able to cope with criticism. Not everyone's going to like what is happening with voter registration. There are going to be people who are critical. It's important to respond to that positively rather than to respond to it in a way that makes people think that there is something to hide. Openness really promotes credibility of the process, and it's a really difficult thing to do. As someone who has had a number of positions, senior positions in EMBs, it's sometimes really awkward to be open, and it hurts to be open, particularly when you've done things that aren't right, and particularly when you know you're going to cop a lot of criticism if you own up to it. But you lose credibility if you don't, if you're not honest about it, if you're not transparent about it. Security, we're looking at both physical security and information security. So you need to be able to protect the people that are wanting to register. You need to protect people who have registered from reprisal. You need to be able to protect the locations in which registration takes place and in which information is held. So there's physical measures that can be taken in terms of security. But you also need to protect the information itself. Protect unauthorised access to the information, protect unauthorised alteration, disclosure of it, and use of it. So the two aspects to security, the physical aspect and the information security aspect. Now, tying in with that is this, what is a fairly Western developed concept of information privacy. Now this, to some extent, comes out of societies where individualism rather than collectivism rules, and people feel they have to have total ownership over their own information about themselves. But it's a reasonable general principle that you give information about yourself, particularly for about a basic human right, registering to vote. You don't want that information used by people that may use it in a way that is negative towards you. So I think a basic thing is there should be no access to registration information for any use that may deter people from exercising their basic human right of registering to vote. Now this may be in legislation, as it is in many countries. It can be monitored. Also important is that if people register, they're informed of what their information may be used for. Now in the UK there's been a running battle over this in a Western developed society, basically between the the mass marketers and the electoral management bodies. Where the mass marketers were used to getting for free lists of everyone and their addresses and their ages and their gender, so they could use this as a free marketing tool. People didn't know this was happening. Weren't aware that when they registered to vote, that it would immediately go to every mail order company in Britain. Now, not necessarily an incentive to get people to register to vote. To be very, very careful about how the information is used, so we don't deter people from registering by the ways in which that information is allowed to be used. Cost effectiveness, not necessarily the cheapest system, but the one that gives the most benefit, the best benefits to cost ratio. Value for money, and not just financial value for money, but also political credibility value for money as well. Obviously, if things cost more, they should give commensurately better performance. Obviously, everyone can't afford a Rolls-Royce system. But it's a matter of getting the value for money, the cost effectiveness there. And when you're looking at costs, it's really important not just to look at the startup costs. It's the total costs over the whole life of the system. It's all relevant costs, no matter where they're incurred. Now, a lot of registration systems based, say, on civil registers, you don't know what it costs to run the voter register, because the costs of civil registration, or a proportion of them, are never factored into the voter registration cost. So to be able to see what your costs and benefits are, you need to be able to identify the costs. Also the risk costs. There are two issues to do with sustainability. One is the longer-term sustainability of the process. The first is it administratively and politically feasible now to do that when you're trying to implement a particular system? Is it appropriate for the current skills resource base own and that can be augmented by assistance? Is it appropriate for the management structure and capacities for the institutions that have to implement it? Is it appropriate for the current cultural and political environment? Now, it has to be this principle has to be adhered to in the short term for there to be any chance of it leading into sustainability in the longer term. It has to be feasible. Accountability. It would be really nice to be able to run a voter registration system that's accountable to no one. We can just go off and do whatever we like. But unfortunately, the real world doesn't work like that. Accountability to ensure that the objectives, the ones that have been agreed with stakeholders to start off with, have been achieved and the principles have been applied. A number of possible mechanisms that different countries use. There's public review, administrative appeal and judicial review rights over decisions made, providing access to observers, public reporting to Parliament. There can also be audit processes, both internal and external, that aid accountability. One of the things that is a bit worrying about many electoral institutions is the lack of audit capacity, or the lack of priority given to audit capacity within the organisation. Donor accountability, I'm not sure that anyone knows how to deal with this. Donors make lots of promises. Money sometimes arrives on time. TA sometimes arrives on time. If it doesn't, it can really screw up an EMB's plans for doing voter registration. How can donors be held accountable? Everyone wants to hold the electoral institutions accountable for what they do. But often they are depending on something outside. Sustainability. We'll have a whole session on this, which is good. But just briefly, sustainability, aiming for minimal or no external dependencies as a start, but there's more to it. And it comes in many, many aspects. It's not just financial and operational sustainability. You need institutional sustainability. Does it provide for, does the registration sort of allow you to do a legal framework that's accepted? Do you have a management structure for it that's been created, that's stable and has renewal in that structure when required? Financial sustainability, obviously important, but you need to look at the whole of life costs, total cost of ownership of the system. And you need to be planning for replacement. Human resource sustainability, available trainable skills, promoting a situation that promotes stability in staffing. Technological operational sustainability, which Mike will be talking no doubt a lot about, talking about ICTs. Most importantly, political sustainability. You can have the best technical system in the world, but if the parties and if civil society and if the general public doesn't like it, doesn't want it, you've got a real problem, no matter how well you do it. It has to be widely accepted. It has to be credible. It has to be a system that actually reduces the potential for conflict rather than adds to the potential for conflict. And lastly, something that some people are starting to think about now is environmental sustainability. Are the processes that are being used for registration environmentally sustainable? Lastly, and I'm just about making it through to the end of this, which is good, credibility. All of these things, this is the other bookend with integrity. Credibility, again, people have to believe that what the voter registration system has done has been conducted in accordance with all the principles, that has been conducted and able to give, reach the objectives intended, that it is based on assisting their human rights. Credibility, very important for it is transparency and equity. If it's not a transparent process is difficult for it to be a credible process. If it's not a credible process, it won't be a politically sustainable process. It will lead to conflict rather than stopping conflict. We've got a